Welcome, friends. Welcome, friends who are gathering. We'll just take a moment as more folks come in from the waiting room. My name is Lena. I am the education coordinator here at Pendle Hill, and I will be sort of guiding us through this evening. I like to invite folks as they gather to remove a distraction and do what you need to start to fully arrive. So perhaps that means closing a tab on your screen. Perhaps that means moving your phone slightly further away from you. I just invite you to take a moment to arrive in this space. And I'll get started in just a minute. Thank you for being with us. Beautiful. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Lena Blunt. I'm the education coordinator here at Pendle Hill, and welcome to our February first Monday lecture with Katy Hawkins. I'll say a little bit more about Katy in a moment. I just want to orient you all to what you can expect from this evening. We'll do a land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce Katy and we'll have some worship before we begin. So first, I want to orient you a little bit to the technology that we'll be using tonight. I know many of you are familiar with Zoom. We are live streaming this evening's lecture to YouTube. And so what we do to help smooth out that process is we mute all participants and we disable the chat at various points so that we can be focused on the presentation. Now, Katy has some queries for us at various points this evening, so we will invite you to write in the chat some of your thoughts, some of your responses to those queries, and we'll open up the chat at that time. Later this evening, we'll also have a question and answer time. At that time, the chat will be closed to hosts only, and you can submit your questions to me, and then that will permit me to help synthesize similar questions and help bring the questions together and share them with Katy for her to respond. So I just wanted to take some time to orient everyone to those sort of technological choices we make. And thank you all for being here with us. I like to say that Pendle Hill is an experiment, or a 91-year-old experiment. So you're all joining us tonight in the continuation of that experiment of faith and learning community. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Katy, for bringing your wisdom into this experiment with us as well. Pendle Hill is also a physical place. While I am zooming in from my home in Germantown, and I know many of us are scattered around, I just want to acknowledge that Pendle Hill, and where I happen to be, is on the land of Lenape-Hoking, which is also the homeland of the Lenni Lenape people for at least 12,000 years before European colonization. Lenni Lenape means original people, and they're respected as the grandfathers by other Native Americans in the Algonquin language family, which inhabited the North American continent east of the Appalachian Mountains. Lenape-Hoking stretches from the source of the Delaware River to its mouth, taking in the Schuylkill and Lehigh River systems in what is now eastern Pennsylvania, all of what is now New Jersey, and a large swath of what is now Delaware, both sides of the Hudson River, from a point above Albany to its mouth, and including all of New York City and the western tip of Long Island. We also just like to acknowledge that the Lenape peoples are still present, though many were forced to move east due to violence and colonization. Several remain hidden in plain sight, and there are currently 3 state-recognized Lenape tribal nations within the original Lenape-Hoking: the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Nation near Bridgeton, New Jersey, the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware in Cheswold, Delaware, and the Ramapo Lenape Nation near Mahwah, New Jersey. Pendle Hill's in relationship with the tribal leadership of these tribal nations. I invite all of us just to take a breath and honor, be curious about the histories of the land that we're on. Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to Embodied Quakerism with Katy Hawkins. Katy is a PhD and has been teaching embodied Quakerism for more than 25 years, but only recently found a name for it, or dared to call it, her ministry. She's a lifelong friend who has been led outside of traditional modes of worship in her search for deeper, more emotionally and viscerally grounded experiences of the divine. Her teaching is characterized by a longing for the genuine integration of body, mind, and spirit. Katy's teaching searches for ways to fuse thinking, feeling, and intuitive knowing to begin to repair their disconnect in Quakerism and in our culture more broadly. She's a member of Chestnut Hill Meeting and a regular teacher at Pendle Hill, where for the last decade, she's led retreats exploring a whole self experience of the divine. You can learn more about Katy in her Moving Poetics classes on her website. And she is working on a book project that will be forthcoming in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, Katy, for being with us. I'd like to invite all of us now into some quiet contemplation, or as we like to say, waiting worship. And Katy, as you feel led to speak out of the quiet, I will pass it over to your ministry.
Thank you, Lena. As you begin to settle into the space, just going to borrow a centering practice from social justice worker Sumitra Rajkumar, which is a way that in somatic circles, somatic centering is practiced. It's a little different than our practice of centering. And coming right out of this experience of waiting worship, just invite you to notice the quality of mind now, the weather in the mind, the vibe in the body, the sense of what's awake, what's asleep, what's tingly, what's dull, what's light, what's dark, warm, cool. And just compare this quality to being after orienting yourself on 3 planes, and I would add to Rajkumar's system a 4th plane. The first plane is quite simply drawing longer on your spine. So really feel feel free to shift your seat really and truly all evening together to find a really grounded pelvis that is neither tipped forward or backwards, but really grounded, and the stalk of your spine runs right up from the center of it. And as you grow on this vertical axis, Rajkumar teaches this as the plane of dignity. And I just love that. Orienting not just to our own bodies on the plane of dignity, but orienting to other people on the plane of dignity. In a way, it's a humble thing to sit tall. We do it so rarely in our culture, and it feels a little bit proud, which is maybe why it requires humility. So as you find a sort of a softening through the chest, that can allow this sort of dignified softness. And maybe if there's a squinchy place in your spine, you could put a little bubble wrap in between the vertebrae and grow another 1/2 inch. Your eyes don't need to be closed. They might be, or they could be softly half-lidded, but just feel a difference maybe in this seat from how we often are at the end of meeting for worship. Envision being drawn up by the tips of the ears. So centering your physical practice in the vertical space. Moving into the horizontal plane. This is the plane of connection. So I would invite you to flip your eyes open and even toggle in between the screens to see one another. This sense of one another's presence is super compromised with Zoom. If we were in the space together, we would be able to see through our peripheral view one another's sort of embodied presence as a vibratory pattern. And all that we can really take note of now is the blurbs of color and the figures of dignity in this long spine, but maybe allow the peripheral view, you don't need to turn your head, to take in the space around you. The objects, the sense of your body in the space of the room, the angles of the corners. And envision not just as you expand the collarbones and breathe sideways through the rib cage, not just the boundaried quality of your skin that holds you separate from the space around you, but also the porous quality of interpersonal availability. This sort of open quality that is the injunction to take up more space, to touch one another laterally. As you find these two planes, the tall plane of dignity, this feeling soft, open connectedness, then I invite you to just orient on the third plane, which is temporality. And we do this through depth. So envision the back body, the back of your skull, the cervical spine, your shoulder blades, the line of the spinal column and how it curves in the lumbar spine and then solidifies in the sacrum, as though it were a really soft wall or even headboard of a bed that you were leaning back into, representing your past. And all that connotes for you, your personal history, your ancestry, your hometown. In the depth plane, moving from the back body, resourcing your embodied presence through your past, come into the now, which is what's happening actually inside the gurgling belly, the beating heart, the lungs, taking in and expelling air, the heartbeat, the diaphragm doming up into the rib cage every time you breathe out, fanning down into the abdomen when you breathe in. All that's happening in the right now is inside, between the front and back planes of your body. Lastly, in this depth plane, take note of the plane of the front body, the face, the throat, fronts of the hips, fronts of the shoulders, fronts of the belly. This is the plane of what we're leaning into. This is the plane where action has potential, where there's choice as to what we're moving towards, what steps we're about to take this spring as we come out of 2 long years of COVID and a long winter and a long February. And as we move from this back body past to inner body present, consider what it is that you're led to embody this spring. What is it that you're leaning into? What is it that you're longing to organize yourself around, even under pressure? And I just invite you to place your hands on your low belly. That's it, center of gravity of the body. And as you find this long line, graceful, dignified, the sense of your connection with your space, with others, boundaried, available, open, receptive, the back to front body, past to future. Anchor your attention where your hands are and just invite with a curious kind of invitation that maybe the breath could come a little further down, and that might not be tonight. But if open diaphragmatic breath is available right now, then give the poor belly permission to swell when you breathe in and soften when you breathe out. So embodied social justice work organizes itself around these 3 planes so that its individuals can organize themselves around how they are feeling and what they are bringing into our work together. And oftentimes that's done with a very simple mood check-in. You just determine one word that captures your mood. It's shared in the circle. And the purpose is to give a feel to the group, organizing around a common purpose. What are the resources that we're working with? And what are the realities of our limitations together? So rather than doing that work of a mood check-in, I'd like to add a 4th plane that might be it might be anywhere for you, and that is the spiritual plane. It could be one of these. Sometimes I can figure the feeling of being plugged into spirit, like the little pods in the Matrix where the back of your head sucks in. It's a little dark. Sometimes it's more like a cord to the sky where the crown is plugged in. Sometimes it's a sense of being rooted underground. And sometimes it's some ambient vibration that makes the energy of the space present to me. And all of us will have different experiences of that 4th plane. But I'd invite one moment of stillness to allow the eyes to do what they want to do, perhaps closing all the way. Retrace vertical axis, horizontal plane, temporal plane, back past present, inner, future forward? And how is the plane of spirit showing up for you in and around the body? And finally, if you can touch ground with those 4 planes, is there a difference in the quality of mind now than in our initial waiting worship together? The very notion of embodied Quaker practice relies on evidence-based testing in the laboratory of your very own sweet body. This is not a ministry to be handed to you. This is grown in the petri dish of your own experience playing with different practices. I'm going to offer 3, maybe 4 tonight, but really ultimately, in a little map of where we're going, these are test runs for possible ideas. These are ideas that I've picked up from different sources. They are 4 or 3 of many possible sort of experimentations that I teach, and some will hopefully sit with you or strike you as interesting, and others will absolutely fall flat, and that is the way. I have been experimenting with, for example, the yogic idea of oming for almost 20 years. And it's only in the last year that I'm like, I'm never going to experience this in this lifetime as a spiritual experience. So that's absolutely legit. I think the possibility of putting something down, having given it a good try, is probably fair and right and good, so that we can preserve our anchor for the stuff that really works. And generally speaking, the practices in our bodies that really work are few and simple and benefit from repetition. So the 3 we're going to practice tonight, the first is just this 3-plane, 4-plane centering adopted from Somatic. The second is an experimentation in speaking truth to power. And the third is what I call a 6th sense inner threshing. It's like a threshing internally. And that will take us well into our time together, and we may or may not have time for one final embodied practice before we open it up for questions. But that's the general map of our time together. We'll be punctuating these practices both with invitations for you to throw some ideas in the chat so that we can share them together, and with some body breaks, which luckily in our practice, we have the sacred pause that we use all the time. And it's a great one in terms of nervous system regulation and coming back into the body. The pause is the best thing we can do. So we're well resourced for this. I just invite you to, if Lena, we can open up the chat. I know all of us have lots of practices for centering down. And maybe just consider tapping in a word or two about a strategy you use, perhaps when you arrive at meeting for worship, or perhaps when you get scattered in meeting for worship for business, of something that helps center you in your body. So Lena just put the question in the chat so you can see it. What are your strategies for recruiting the body's wisdom in centering? O notes deep, low breathing. We'll be doing a little breath work together. Hand on heart is a great one. Central nervous system is absolutely up for being soothed by just a little touch. Great, I love it. Aparna, alternate nostril breathing. Maybe we'll have a little bit of time for that. Feet on the ground. Focus on nature. Feeling my feet. Wiggling. Wiggling is a great one, Mary Beth. I love it. Wiggling is a really important practice. Finding your seat is not a one-shot deal. Crossing my legs one way and my arms the opposite way. A little brain exercise, like a brain gym. All the little noises. Yes, we'll be practicing listening to all the little noises around us. Closing the eyes. Coming home. Opening up to looking at others in the circle. Resting the weight on the back of the pew or chair instead of holding yourself up. If only our benches were designed just to prop the sacrum so the shoulders could be free. It would be so much easier to be open. Fabulous. Feeling breath as the pulse of spirit, loving kindness. Hands. Filling my hands. There's a whole world of practice around what we do with our hands. Readjusting sit bones on the bench, part of wiggling. Great. That's fabulous. So we all have these strategies that we use to ground. I guess I'll take that as an alley-oop to know that you all are very practiced in these arts of embodied centering. And I kind of figured I would be preaching to the choir. Of course, this is going to be a self-selecting group. If you signed on for talking about embodied Quakerism, chances are that you are grounded in the body as part of your spiritual life. So as a crew, we are not necessarily reflective of all of Quakerism, but part of this centering on the plane of others from somatic justice work is to concretize what your resources are as a group. And as a group, given that there are this panoply of options for how to ground into our bodies, we are well resourced to make a little push into the realm of how our faith might make a little bit more space for embodied practice. And maybe we can carry that work forward past tonight. I thought it might be useful to let you know where I'm coming from, to situate myself. I am a lifelong Quaker. My mom is the Quaker in the family, and she was a serious seeker who was a religion major in college and found Quakerism and has always been fascinated by spiritual journeys. From her first of like a bunch of books, which was called Archetypes of Conversion, which was looking at conversion narratives, and her last book, which was about foster parents of HIV positive children and children with full-blown AIDS. And much of that work was, I would say, a study in faith. So my mom is the Quaker hub for me. My meeting growing up, should be said, was a leftist, liberal, academic town. It was Middletown, Connecticut, where Wesleyan is. So my upbringing in Quakerism, through my home meeting, through Quaker camps like Journey's End, and I see somebody from JE, and Farm and Wilderness, and to some degree Haverford College, is a very unprogrammed leftist political Quakerism. It is also very tethered to nature and simplicity. So in terms of my orienting compass as a child, the experiences were natural, relationship with the land and living simply, and increasingly, my way in was through the body, and that's something that I didn't find a home for in my Quaker networks. So I went on a little journey, as you do when you're a teen, and I started going. I took a liturgical dance workshop. have always been a dancer, ballet, and then later modern. But I took a liturgical dance class that brought me into this congregational church where I grew up, and I wound up like living in that church as a teenager. I was in the choir, and I learned all of the sort of scriptural passages and prayers that I know from that church. And it wasn't until I had babies that Laura Melly, who's here with me tonight, thank you for eldering me, Laura dragged me back to meeting. So that was a long hiatus from Quakerism. And in that time, the threads that most informed my exploration of the body were I would say modern dance for sure, but also poetry and adventures in yoga and Buddhism. Zen Buddhism specifically, I'm drawn to a lot of discipline and structure, maybe because my nature is very undisciplined and unstructured, and I benefit from almost a monk-like set of strategies for centering, simplifying. Silence is big, solitude is big. So I found in Buddhism a kind of a discipline around the body that I couldn't understand how we function without in Quakerism. Only because the body is so difficult to harness towards our spiritual experience. It is a wayward and complicated animal. So Zen Buddhism specifically gave me a lot of strategies for being able to sit. And then I fell into yoga only because I was pregnant, and that's what pregnant women do, is they do prenatal yoga. And there I found a whole world. So I do not consider myself a yogi. It is not my tradition. If I could say that I teach embodied spirituality, that's how I would explain my teaching. But in America, the translation of spiritually centered movement is either martial arts or yoga. So that's how Leslie's like, yeah. So those are sort of the threads that are coming together in my spiritual soup. Zen Buddhist teachings, yogic principles, and poetry. And the poetry is a little bit rogue, because one would think, what does the poetry have to do with the spiritual experience of the body? But I see several of my poetry lovers in the house, and I think what's different about poetry and what makes it different from prose is that it bypasses the rational brain. Somehow the mystery of a poem gets us someplace different that does not require that we figure it all out. It's a gut, intuitive movement in us, like a poem calls to us. So most recently, in my adult incarnation, to the degree that it is, I teach embodied explorations of poems. So thank you for mentioning my book, Lena, and it is coming out in the next couple of weeks, and it's called Thinking Feelingly. This is a borrowing from a line from King Lear, which is seeing feelingly, spoken to a king by a blind man. And thinking feelingly is just an explanation of how we can experience language and ideas through a feeling state. And that's really where my Quakerism lives. How to bypass the rational mind. And I would ask you, I would invite you to imagine the conversations that take place in your meeting community. And maybe it's adult spiritual education, or maybe it's a committee meeting, or maybe it's a meeting for worship for business. But consider what we have to gain as a community by getting past rational modes of meaning making and towards intuitive compassion and felt experience. So that's my ministry as I've come to understand it. And I think we need a body break. At least I do. It's hard to articulate your ministry. So let's just play with a little practice of tapping. You can shift your seat. Again, wiggling, is that what it was? Wiggling in the chat is one of our, wiggling, yes. So wiggle around until you find a second easy seat. And if you have never done EFT, it's drawn from trauma research, but it's really beneficial to all of us. Probably this is not going to be a full-blown exercise in the middle of meeting for worship, but there are sneaky variations, which I'll share with you. So just begin. It's a light touch, yeah? You're not bonking yourself. It's a light tap on the crown of your head. Feel, if you can, that the shoulders can soften away from the ears even as you're tapping. You don't have to force them down. Bring your hands around to the back of your skull and tap there, especially towards the base of the skull, which I discovered by accident, but it actually is the 9th chakra in the yoga system of the body. And I like to think of it by its name, the mouth of God. It's the place where your spine inserts into the skull. Useful thing about tapping random places is to imagine each one is sacred. Each one is the mouth or ear of God. Bringing your hands just above your ears, might be a little tender there. And we're actually going to tap the face, so it's going to require a light touch. Above the eyebrows for starters. Work your way around to the outer eyebrow to the temple, very light touch. Notice the temperature of your fingers. Use the bubbles of the fingers rather than the fingernails. And then it's just below your eyes at the top of the cheekbone. Difficult with glasses, do your best. Work your way down to the top lip. So it's just below your nose. You're kind of giving your teeth a little love. And bring your way to your chin. We do the collarbones. So feel just above your clavicles where there's that little valley. And here you can use the touch that's appropriate for you. It might be a little firmer. Take a breath into your belly. Dump it out of your mouth. We're going to do one side at a time. Getting under the armpit where the rib cage is. If you fish around, you'll find a tender spot. It might not happen the first time you do this. When you've gone under the armpit, if you've ever had acupuncture, this point really hurts me sometimes, but it's the place in the front of the forearm. It's not the inner crease. It's where they put the needle and where the meat of your forearm lands on your elbow. Firm touch on your forearm down to the second to last spot, which is just above the thenar eminence, which is the best word ever. And it's not the thick muscle of the thenar eminence, it's where the bones meet, like a V in the thumb and the forefinger bone. And then the last point is your karate chop point. Everybody does this backwards in the first time, but you're using the same hand to just get the karate chop place. And we'll do the other side. Under the other armpit. If you're interested in the science of tapping, I'm not the one to ask, but you can totally Google it. Bring your hand to the front of the elbow. Pretty firm touch along the forearm flesh to the, let's call it the thenar eminence V. And then the karate chop. At some point in this practice, maybe you felt that one point was particularly sensitive. Give a little time first to the breastbone on either side of the sternum. And here you can pound pretty drummingly, and then the belly. So whatever the point was for you that felt most sensate, return to that spot just for a moment and tap there. For me, it's my cheekbones. For you, it could be totally different. As you're working there, if it's something with two sides, switch sides now. If when I mentioned in the beginning, something about mood, something you came with, maybe it was tired, maybe it was nervous, maybe it was impatient. Just imagine that when you let your hands go into your lap, that goes too. You're draining yourself of what you came in with. And as you rest in your hands in your lap, what was it? It was open hands, relaxed hands. Turn your palms to face up. Give a tiny lift to your chin. Your eyes can be open or closed as you choose. Just notice. And then turn the palms to face down in your lap and find a little dip to your chin. You don't have to drop the chin onto your chest. It's just maybe a ½ inch. Notice if that quiets nervous system. This next exercise is an exercise on speaking truth to power, which is a little bit more challenging. So I would invite you to take a brain break if you need to at any point. Just kind of kick back, close your eyes, tune me out for a moment, and touch back in. Maybe do a little tapping. The secret is that something like this you can do in meeting. A little bit of tapping when you feel triggered. So this practice is not one that I was taught. It's one that I was moved to create by the incredibly beautiful words of Audre Lorde. And the model, the somatic model that she offers in her poem, her famous poem, Coal. Many of you, I'm sure, know this poem. And if anybody is, well, I guess I'll just read it myself. So if you're not familiar with Audre Lorde, she is a powerhouse activist and poet. And this poem is challenging. So let me frame it. Imagine yourself as I was going to say a snowman, but a snow person. Yeah. And the bottom of the base is broadest, right? The boulder of snow at the base is the hips, the legs, the earth element of your ground floor. And this is it's not only yogic thought. Many, many traditions locate the lowest part of the body and correlate it with earth. So as you tap in to that boulder of earth, move your way up to the core. And this is associated with fire, the fire of digestion, the fire of transmutation, all of the changes happening in the in the center of the body. And then there's the head, the throat, the element of air. This goes back to Aristotle, right? The three parts of the soul, rational and nutritive and appetitive, but I invite you to sort of realize them rather than cognitively realizing that it's logical, these associations. Instead, we're going to come into a practice of feeling these three brains, let's call them. The three brain theory comes from Suzanne Rivers originally, who is a powerful somatics worker, but Susan Raffo recently published after Rivers' death this theory of the three brain system, which is that at all times, it's useful to think from not just our executive function brain, not just our individual knowledge brain, but from our heart brain, associated with the thymus, the lungs, the heart, the pericardium, the changes in oxygen to carbon dioxide, the chambers of the heart that change the blood flow and pump it back out. The gut brain is the consciousness of spleen, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, intestine, colon, stomach, right? So both the heart brain and the gut brain are about transformation. They're about change. And they're also about relationality. One thing turning into another, taking in what's outside of us, digesting it, and allowing it to change us, which it does, right? So three brains, not one. As Quakers, what would meeting feel like if we were oriented not just to our head brain, but to our heart brain and to our gut brain? And science is coming along for the ride to realize that these three systems that were embryologically linked in us can be reintegrated. There is consciousness. There are actually brain cells in the gut. There is consciousness to the heart. They've found not just like the psoas, right? Which is not just a muscle, it is a part of the body that is perceiving. The diaphragm is taking cues from the outside and making individual choices apart from the brain. The endocrine glands, we're going back to sort of medieval science, medieval medicine of the system of humors. Originally, or at some point, many different cultures have drawn parallels between our emotional states and our actual body parts and thought that the body is as much a part of I was going to say cognition, but that sounds a little bit too cognitive. But the body brains are just as much a part of the way that we are and feel and relate and reach other people as our cognitive brain is. So three brain theories. I just like to frame the idea of speaking truth to power. Injunction to 18th century friends, right? This is a charge that's given to all of us. I can read a passage from the 1955 pamphlet on speaking truth to power, which maybe orients us a little bit to the way that, hang in with me, that anger plays in to speaking truth to power in a way that is not demonized, right? So the oppositions of hatred and love do not extend to hatred and anger. Anger is not the opposite of hatred. Anger and sometimes rage is the teaching that we have something that we care very deeply about that's being troubled, that there's work to do. No, I'm stuck with John Marshall. All right, well, I won't read you the passage, but maybe I'll find it in a bit. In any case, this work, this call, this, let's say, charge, is that so as we love, so we act. The things that we care most about, those are the things that drive our action. So let's call this deliberate, discerned action a way of identifying anger, discovering where it lives in the body, metabolizing that anger, processing it, abiding with it, waiting for it to do its thing. It's very much like when we receive a message, right? That we wait for the burbles, we wait for the burning. It's doing important metabolic work informing the action. And then last, we give the anger productive form in the form of action. And this is really different than Ross Gay, the wonderful poet Ross Gay, calls this, he calls it the little annoyance monster. He identifies his little annoyance monster that is fundamentally different from a gut sense of something wrong. So once we can pick apart our body sense of our ego being threatened in whatever way, and this gut knowledge that something is awry and must be corrected, that way of separating is part of the discernment of when it's time for us to speak truth to power. I really am attached to Stephen Cope, who is a Buddhist and a yogi. His offering that the etymology of enthusiasm is entheos, the God within. So one of the ways that we can identify what we care about enough to act on is that there's this, he calls it the spirit leaping toward, the spirit within leaping up toward something. So while there is this gut sense that is not the sad little annoyance monster, but legitimate gut sense, there is also this entheos, this feeling of the spirit within leaping towards something, some movement, some action. So Audre Lorde, in this poem, offers almost a rendering in real time of this process of moving sequentially from the earth to the fire, the alchemical change of the gut brain towards the coming into air. So this is Audre Lorde's coal. And the first line, importantly, crucially, I think, is simply the letter I. Every sutra begins with a line that encapsulates everything that is to follow and is a way of introducing it. And this one letter line, the only single word line, the only single letter line in the poem, gives you the substance that's being cooked. It's her. It's us. We are being cooked in the fire. So this is funky as a white woman reading this poem. I is the total black being spoken from the earth's inside. There are many kinds of open. How a diamond comes into a knot of flame. How a sound comes into a word, colored by who pays what for speaking. I'll read that stanza again. I is the total black being spoken from the earth's inside. how a diamond comes into a knot of flame, how a sound comes into a word colored by who pays what for speaking. I'm noticing the time, and I'm going to take you to the final stanza. As fabulous as the alchemical process of the middle of the poem is, it is long. Here's the final stanza. Love is a word, another kind of open. As a diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Take my word for jewel in your open light. Take my word for jewel in your open light. If we can take Audre Lorde as our teacher and attempt to replicate, especially if we are not people of color and we don't pay as much for speaking. If we can take the injunction to find our ground floor, our roots, what we're about, cook it in the fire of what we care about, to emerge with a diamond that is clear, strong, and cut glass, it's such a lovely model for how something needs to, the alchemical act of speech. So I'm just going to invite you to wiggle, find a good seat, and take stock. If you can reach your feet, that would be fabulous. If you can't reach your feet, please just scrub them on the ground a little bit and spread the bones of your feet out. If you can touch your feet, you might take your knuckles and place them right in the arch of your foot. If you're wearing shoes, you could wring out your ankles as though you were wringing out a rag. You could work up to the calf muscle. You could feel the bubble of each toe and pull on it. Get a little, I call it getting drooly. Let the mouth go soft. Let the face relax. And just touch ground with the other foot. We're making contact with the ground floor of being, the earth element. The feet are the best way to ground, as several testaments in the chat. And as you need the feet, I'm going to invite you to find a particular spot that is going to lift our attention up to the core. This is the time of the winter that in the Chinese medicine system is governed by water. And as you move into early spring, the next element is actually wood. Not as like a plank of wood or a part of a tree, but as pure potential for what is going to come into form as spring moves forward. So we move from the inchoate, loose, organic hibernation of winter, water, into this pure potential of where we are right now. We just celebrated Groundhog Day and Imbolc and St. Bridget's Day and all of these turning points, moving towards fire that takes over later in the spring. So the point I'd invite you to stimulate, show you my foot, your inner ankle bone. Move up from your inner ankle bone, 1, 2 thumb prints, and very tenderly, you'll be on a bony landmark. You move in just slightly towards the back of the leg, you'll find a tender place. And as you rest the thumbs there, this is the acupressure point for the returning current. It lifts energy from the downward current into the core. So as you relax the bones of your feet, you soften your thigh bones down and you let the hips be heavy. I'd invite you to move your attention to your belly. Notice if you can feel any movement, the gurgles of digestion, perhaps the heat of digestive fire. That funky tango of the diaphragm rising and falling as the lungs expand and contract. There's a whole world of trauma research around examining that place where the diaphragm and the lungs meet and sourcing power from that place. Notice front to back body, how wide you can be, laterally expanding through your rib cage. And I just invite you, as you move into this center, to think about a time when you felt called to speak truth to power. At any point that this becomes uncomfortable, you just take a breath break. But if you can go into the faces, the context, the feeling state, the experiential troubling of that alchemical work of something requiring action. The spleen, the kidneys are detoxing, purifying. Lastly, we're going to bring the hands to the throat and just stroke along the Adam's apple. Just opening and closing the larynx touches you in with the air element. In yoga, this is the Udana Vayu. This is the element of the words that emerge being the truth. And then gently let your hands come into your lap. And if you're comfortable closing your eyes, do. And I'd just like you to reflect on that scene that you summoned up to mind of this troubled water, rage telling you where action needed to happen. And consider what it felt like when you did or did not speak. Take my word for diamond in your open light. Take a big breath in, dump it through your mouth. The invitation I find in this long central stanza of Audre Lorde that I will put in a document I'll send your way is that sometimes we jump too soon before things have had their time to cook, to alchemize. That work of separating the wheat from the chaff, of figuring out what's toxin and what's goodness, is a process that we would benefit from sitting with just a little longer. And maybe that relates to our waiting worship and the impulses that show us that it's time for us to give our ministry, that uncomfortable waiting is part of the process of the truth truly emerging as a diamond. Concrete, simple, typically. Take a body break. So sometimes it's useful when you've been sitting for a little while, practice lymphatic drainage. if you just bring the rim of your hands onto the base of your skull, you're pulsing in and down, not so much sliding skin over skin, but using the skin to palpate into the flesh of the base of your skull, the occipital ridge, and the little valley just beneath. My hope is that at some point in this process, you'll need to swallow. That will be good news. That will be a sign that the nasal cavity is clearing. Mental clearing. If you can make Trekkie hands genetically, go for it. If Trekkie hands are not in your wheelhouse, and I love watching you all figure you can V any old finger you choose and bring it right under your earlobe. And then you're using your proximal knuckle, the ridge of your knuckles where your fingers meet your palm, to knead in and down, pulsing in and down just below your ears. A little higher, Terry. You're like right hugging your earlobe with the V. Again, bonus if you have to swallow. Last point, ridge of the fingertips, just over your collarbones in that hollow place that we tapped. Pulse in and down. They say some of these require 75 pulses, others 50. We're not doing that tonight. We're just taking a few. I'm thinking of the ministry of Bill Kreidler. I don't know if any of you know Bill's ministry, but he was an amazing, amazing minister. And, you know, another tragic loss, too early to AIDS, but all of his ministry is available online for free. And I listened to this one thing that he did. Wrap your arms around your body. This is related to Bill Kreidler's message, and just stroke your hands along your upper arms. This feels corny. It's called havening. The thing is that we're not talking to the rational brain that thinks it's corny. We're talking to the reptile brain, which is very simple and very ancient, and receives this cue as a cue of safety. So Bill Kreidler he's hilarious, and he was talking about having lost his compass. This was his ministry for, I think, FGC on keeping the flame. And he said that he turned to one of his friends who said, Bill, you gotta kneel every morning and pray. Put the other hand on top. And he said, well, I'm Quaker. We don't really kneel down to pray. She said, shut up. And I just love that. Whenever my pride resists some potentially corny body practice, I think of Bill Kreidler's friend saying, shut up. And he knelt every morning for prayer, and it became a crucial part of his spiritual life. Just flick that off your hands. All right. I'm aware of time. I do want to offer up just one more practice. When I mentioned separating the wheat from the chaff and the multiple brains in the body, how are we doing in our seat? Are you guys okay? Are you hanging in? All right. Good. Rob's giving me a good friendly nod. So you can rock. You can do whatever it will be that's going to let you sit just a little bit longer. During the Q&A, you can march around the room and do anything you like. So I'm calling this internal threshing. 6 senses and not 5. And many of you know what I'm talking about. You have some kind of meditation training. So as you get comfortable in your seat, we're going to touch ground sequentially with the 5 senses that we know in our Western science. And the first is the sense of sight. So please, if you can close your eyes, do, and just cup your eyes with your hands so that the palm is resting over the eyelids. And all of a sudden it feels very private and dark. And I'm not going to speak for just a few moments so you can be in that still internal space. And then get enough room from your palms that you can open your eyes and just look into the blackness there. And notice if there's color, movement. Notice if there's sort of the mercury blob like shifting in the darkness. Close your eyes behind your hands and allow the hands to come down into your lap. And now notice behind your eyelids the shift in color, tone. Breathe in through your nose. Let it go through your mouth. You can keep your eyes closed or softly float them half open. This is a little hard to cue because you're going to cup your hands over your ears and create little seashells with your palms. And we're going to just practice listening to the stillness inside your seashell hands. Letting the hands settle down. As you listen to the stillness, hopefully there is an ambient noise around you. See if you can feel the sound of white noise. It's a static quality to the air. And this is a more advanced practice, but there are two tones. John Cage perceived them in an anechoic chamber, his first visit in Yale. One is that static sound of white noise. The other is the bass tone that undergirds it. This is very hard to hear that second one, especially without a few minutes to center down. But let's just take a moment of stillness and see if you can intuit under the static sound of the white noise, what's called the nadam, that deeper bass sound. And shifting the attention to the smell in your space. It'll make you hungry if you haven't had dinner. Breathe really deep through your nose and see if you can catch residual traces. It may be that you need to smell your hands. This is a difficult one. And just rest your attention on the bridge of your nose. And come into the sense of taste. You can masticate the air. Relax the tongue right where the top teeth meet the gums, just behind the top teeth. And lastly, touch in with the sense of the air on your skin. Full face, where you're closed and it's warm. The relative humidity or dryness of the air around you. The quality when you take the breath in through the nostrils and the change in the quality when you exhale. Any current, any airflow. And lastly, turn the attention to your sixth sense, which is quite simply the brain. Notice the mental field. What's the pace of the thoughts moving through? What's the tone? What's the mood in there? Just consider if you were to approach cognition, rational thought, just the way you approached a sound in the space around you, how would it change the sense of messaging, divine messaging? What's the different quality? One monk I really loved who talked me through my uncle's dying gave the analogy of being at the center of a carousel and we are the spoke, and watching the thoughts like all the pretty horses going by. And he said the work is not to get on any of them, but to stay as the spoke. So the patterning of the mind as just one more sense frees us from feeling so personal about either a brilliant idea or a terrible mood or a really hateful thought. It depersonalizes it as one more trick of the senses. I would just invite you to return to your returning current work this spring, coming from this soup. 2019 and 2020 is like one big soup. And this wintry time. And as you think of what you're moving towards, what is it that who and what do you love, and how do you organize yourself around that? What is the action that you are being called to take? Could you take a moment to thresh the wheat from the chaff and just class any cogitation, any thought moving through the mind as one more sense and see what abides? Any somatic practice is just notice, do something, and then notice what abides. So let's finally take 1 minute to sit. And my invitation to you is just this spring, if you consider rational thought as another sense, can you come to an awareness of a deeper way of intuiting what you're being called to? Allowing the eyes to close. Touching ground with the color behind the eyelids. Static in the room, maybe beneath the white noise, the bass. Any scent. Any taste. the feeling and quality and current of the air. And the workings of the mind. Lightly holding up for consideration. What is taking form for you this spring? Thank you, friends. I do want to leave a moment for questions. I'm sorry I ran over, Lena. I promised I wouldn't, and I did.
It's just fine. That was wonderful. Thank you, Katy. And to remind folks, please feel free to submit questions in the chat to me. This will help us synthesize any similar questions we have and use this time well. So please do submit any questions that you might have. Yeah, here we go. We have a couple. There's some sort of around the theme of trauma in the body. And if you had thoughts or things to offer for folks for whom centering into the body can be a scary experience or doesn't feel like a safe place to center because of trauma.
Yeah. Oh, a world in a question. A big world in a question. Well, let me say this. I made a little Padlet for you, which if you've never used Padlet, it is designed to be interactive. And we thought that might be a little challenging with our short amount of time together. So instead, I'm just going to offer it to you as a record of our 3 exercises and a resource list at the end. And in that resource list, there are oodles and caboodles of especially somatic social justice workers who work in and around trauma. I would invite you to first and foremost, he may not be first on the list, but Resmaa Menakem's recent work, My Grandmother's Hands, will knock your socks off if you haven't been there. And he, in his bibliography, offers sort of where he is sourcing his work in trauma research. So if you want sort of cutting edge work with a backbone in how this relates to especially work from Besser van der Kolk around the war trauma, that's a really good resource to look to. And we could go there together for another hour. So hang around after and we'll just, I'm kidding.
Great, thank you. So I did put the Padlet there in the chat. That link is available for you to check out some of those resources that Katy just mentioned.
And also Audre Lorde's poem is there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. There are some folks here who came tonight who are not Quaker and are expressed some curiosity about your sense of to what extent embodiment is a quality of Quaker worship nowadays.
Does anyone else want to answer that? I say that we are moving towards an awareness. For example, in a recent quagmire that my meeting found ourselves in, our lovely meeting member Eileen Flanagan held a discernment exercise collectively where we moved between two poles of the space physically to represent physically what we felt about worship sharing and whether it should be guided or whether it should be absolutely free form. And that kind of practice that incorporates embodied research in order to anchor our actual practices as a community in body aware practices, I would say we're coming along. And that's, again, we'll kind of, that I would invite you all to keep in touch with me, because that is work that needs doing, and I would love to do it with you. So please keep in touch with me, and Lena can put you in touch, but we're working on it.
Great. There's a question here about how Buddhists teach the half smile, and this person notices many frowns sometimes during worship in their meeting. What are your thoughts on the embodiment of smiling?
Yeah, you know, R.I.P. Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't think anyone taught smiling the way Thich Nhat Hanh did, partly because his voice is literal magic, like spell-binding magic, the tone, the quality of his voice, but also because everything that he did breathed joy. It was like the smile was the after effect of everything that he was. But he did, I always call it Thich Nhat Hanh mouth yoga, when you notice yourself scowling and you just practice like a very big grin and then allow it to settle and allow its imprint to remain. I agree that I think in general, joy practices have a place in lifting Quaker we need levity, y'all. Like, we need a little levity, you know? And we do such good work in the world, and we are so anchored in right action. And maybe somebody was there. I know Ellen was there on Saturday for the Philadelphia yearly meeting. And maybe O is still here. But there was a woman in this, 5-hour session of the Philadelphia yearly meeting around discussions of race, named Michaela, who asked this question in the chat. She said, is our lack of embodiment in meeting for worship keeping people out? And I sort of sat back in my seat, like, I never thought of our disembodiment as a collective, as a tacit message for who is welcome, or maybe it was a really interesting question. So I would just say that a lot comes with joy in the way of openness to growth. And as Quakers, we're constantly wrestling with how can we grow our faith younger? How can we bring people of color? How can we keep our faith alive, period? And I think some of these answers lie in embodied practices, how to round out the availability of spirit so that it's a more open and welcoming space.
Thank you for that. That's actually a really beautiful point to wrap things up, and we're not able to get to every single question tonight. But in our final minute here, Katy, I just want to say thank you and see if you have any closing thoughts for us.
I'm looking at you all in this gallery and just feeling very grateful for your presence tonight. And and grateful for your sweetness. Does that make sense? I think sometimes we undervalue vulnerability and sweetness. So I just want to thank you for that contribution to safe space and to invite you to take it wide out from here.
Thank you so much. Francis?